As you can see, there is a little bit of overlap between period 6 and period 7 by 8 years or so. And I'm not gonna rush through those 8 years, but I will briefly describe it. So, ever since the Civil War, which began with the election of what president? Abraham Lincoln, all the way up through the election of Dr. Woodrow Wilson in like 1913, every president was a Republican, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat who served 2 non-consecutive terms. All right, so we're talking from 1861 to 1913, every president, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, was Republican. Okay. Now, once Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but he was a progressive Republican. And so he was all about using the government to better the lives of people, as evidenced by him mediating the labor strike between labor and business. So he acted more like a Democrat. And as the progressive movement moves on, really the difference between Democrats and Republicans is very hard to find, okay? Ultimately, though, once World War I begins during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, there becomes a widening gap, and that gap gets wider and wider between Democrats and Republicans, ultimately leading up to the Great Depression, which widens the gap even further, okay? And that gap remains just as wide today, or maybe even wider. All right, so as we begin with period 7, we're going to start with talking about World War I. And I have a little abbreviation, anagram. What is that called? What is it? Acronym. Thank you. I'm not that smart. English terms. An acronym. And it says World War I was caused by an animal. Now, it was not literally caused by an animal, but each of those letters stands for a cause that you can point to and say, this is a reason why World War I started. Now, the causes of World War I is really not American history, because it's technically really European history. But does America ultimately get involved in World War I? Yeah, so I think you should know why it started. Make sense? Okay. Now, I'm going to go over each of these, just not in order. So don't expect, I don't have them in order. But we're going to talk about each one of them. So, first, nationalism. Most Americans wanted to stay out of the war, but throughout the 19th century, the 1800s, many countries in the Western world were deeply influenced by the concept of nationalism. What is nationalism?
Pride for one country.
Perfect. Couldn't say it any better myself. A devotion to one's own culture and interests of your own nation. Devotion. Often, nationalism can lead to competitive and antagonistic rivalry. And America was no different. We just didn't do it with other countries. We had ideas of nationalism, especially after the War of 1812, Go America, which led to the idea of manifest destiny, right? We're the greatest. We need to expand. Didn't work out well for the Native Americans. But Americans are no stranger to this idea of nationalism. And European countries were certainly swept up in this. So each country was intensely devoted and proud of its own nation. Okay? Now, in this, it breeds an atmosphere of competition. So, Germany, at the time of the outbreak of World War I, was growing in power, becoming an industrial power. In addition to this feeling of intense pride in your own nation, various ethnic groups did not like, they resented the domination by others and longed for their own independence. So there were ethnic groups within certain countries who didn't feel that pride, didn't feel that nationalism, and wanted to have a country all their own. For example, the people of Eastern Europe, which were under the control of Russia, the Slavic people. Places like Serbia in the Balkans, which were under the control of other countries, wanted to be free. I think that Serbia was actually under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So as a result, Russia and Austria-Hungary were rivals for influence over Serbia. Okay, so the idea here is that nationalism breeds competition and distrust of other nations. Because you are only proud and interested in your own, you're not really willing to look at it from anyone else's perspective. This should be easy for us Americans to understand. Okay? All right, so that's nationalism, which is a cause of World War I. Imperialism. Imperialism. What is imperialism? Something America had just recently got involved with. What is imperialism? It's empire building. Empire building with an E. Imperialism is empire building. For centuries, European nations had been doing this, slowly extending their economic and political control over the various peoples of the world. So those places that come under the control of the various empires, they're called colonies. And colonies supplied those European imperial powers with raw materials and markets to sell their manufactured goods. Does this sound familiar? Mm-hmm. America had this going on when we were a colony. Has America recently gotten into the imperialism game around the time of World War I? Yeah, where? The Philippines, Cuba, Guam, Hawaii. Yeah, we're trying to get in on this. European nations had been doing it for hundreds of years. We were a colony of Great Britain for since Sir Walter Raleigh came over here. Jamestown, 1607. This is not a new idea. Now, if all these countries that are trying to build empires are distrustful of each other and are all competing for the same places to colonize, do you think that there's potential for conflict? Everybody's head should be moving up and down. Yes. Yes. Okay. Germany, in particular, as Germany industrialized, it competed with Britain, France, for contest of other colonies. Okay. Following me so far? So everybody understands nationalism and imperialism and how those things contributed to World War I. So you've got a political cartoon here. And you can see, you get your major political powers. Germany, France, Russia, Britain, they're represented here by these men. And then you have like somebody bringing in a big plate of food, and this would represent an area. This says Burma. I think it's been called Burma, and then Myanmar, and I think it's Burma again now. But this is like Southeast Asia, all right, like near Vietnam. These are third world country places, Zulu, Afghanistan, Cyprus, Turkey. These are places that have raw materials, that have dark-skinned inhabitants whom these people think that they have their right, under God's eyes, to control. Okay? Kind of like that idea of organizing the chaos that Teddy Roosevelt had. Okay? And these are the countries that are trying to get in on it. Okay? It is their right and duty as people, as men of civilized nations to do that. Okay? Now you can see they're kind of figuring how they're going to divide this stuff up. But, do they really want to divide stuff up? No, they want it all to be their own. So that is how militarism contributes to imperialism contributes to World War I. Militarism. What's it sound like? I can't understand you.
Military.
Okay, military. Big, small? Big. Empires are expensive to build and even more expensive to defend. For some reason, these people you go and subjugate and control, sometimes they fight back. I don't know why. Maybe they don't like it. So it's expensive to keep these people oppressed. So the growth of nationalism and imperialism leads to an increase in military spending. Okay, so you're naturally going to have a big military to protect and defend your own empire. Now, does that make sense? It's natural to have a big military if you're going to defend your empire. Now, I want you to imagine you're trying to protect and defend your empire, and then all the people around you are also trying to protect their empire. And all the people around you are also trying to expand their empire. And all the people around you have an industrial economy capable of producing tanks and bombs and planes and guns. And what?
Like submarines and stuff.
Yes, submarines. Absolutely. So, because each nation wanted to have a bigger empire, each nation felt that they had to have the strongest military. So you begin to see a massive buildup of armies and navies all over the world. It's just the policy of building up armed forces to protect and expand. By 1890, the strongest of the European continents, the strongest nation on the European continent was Germany, largely because of their industrial abilities. Germany had already set up an army reserve system that drafted and trained young men in 1890. World War I doesn't start for like 20 more years. So 20 years of doing that. That's like 2 generations of people. So Britain initially was not very alarmed by Germany doing this, as Britain was an island nation, which had always relied on its navy for its defense. And the British Navy was the strongest navy in the world. But in 1897, the leader of Germany, whose name was Wilhelm, with a W, so it looks like Wilhelm, Wilhelm, Wilhelm II. You guys know his title? He's a Kaiser. Kaiser is German for like Caesar. Wilhelm II, Germany's Kaiser, it's like an emperor, decided that his nation should be a world power as well. And soon Britain and Germany, their shipyards were building the largest battleships and destroyers the earth had ever seen. Now, if you are France, Russia, Italy, Japan, America, you see these 2 countries building this enormous military, these enormous warships. You just going to let them do it and be left behind? everybody else does it too. That is militarism. That is militarism. Okay? You with me? Anybody confused yet? There's more reasons for fighting. The next is the alliance system. The alliance system. After 15 years or so of this buildup, you begin to realize, man, if something were to break loose, I don't want to be left alone. So by 1907, there were two major defense alliances in Europe. The Triple Entente, later known as the Allies. The Triple Entente, later known as the Allies, was like France, Britain, Russia. This is 1907. And there's the Triple Alliance. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. An empire mostly of Middle Eastern lands was also involved, mainly controlled by the Turks. But they were together, later known as the Central Powers. So the Triple Entente, the Allies, Triple Alliance, also known as the Central Powers. The alliances provided a measure of international security because nations were reluctant to disturb the balance of power. Because it's like, hey, if I mess with one of these countries, they're all going to team up on me. So people they thought this would be a way to prevent fighting. And we're going to ally ourselves with other nations to prevent, to kind of act as a deterrent. Nobody's going to mess with us if they know that if they mess with us, it's not just going to be us. It's going to be me and all my country over here and a country over here and a country over here. They all got my back. So that's kind of, think about yourself in the lunchroom. Somebody going to mess with you? You sit around all your buds and hopefully they got your back if somebody mess with you. Right? But ultimately, though, every one of these nations at the lunch table, they're all carrying weapons. And if somebody messes with one of them, everybody starts fighting with each other with these horrible, dangerous, deadly weapons, and everybody ends up dead. And that's kind of how World War I went. Because it doesn't take much to set it off. I mean, all these nations are heavily armed and kind of, itching to use them. And all it took was one spark, one teeny tiny little event to trigger all this stuff into action. Does anybody know what that one little teeny tiny event was? Sophie? The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Look at that mustache. Man. That's Archduke Ferdinand, the top left. The spark flared on the Balkan Peninsula, where I just told you earlier about those ethnic rivalries that existed. Russia wanted access to the Mediterranean Sea. Germany wanted a rail link to the Ottoman Empire. Both of these things would go directly through the Balkans, or like Serbia. All right. So it was already volatile because of all these reasons that we've already said. And in June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, it's a good band if you like that kind of music too, Franz Ferdinand. But the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was the heir to the Austrian throne. So he was like a prince of Austria. He was visiting the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo. Visiting the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. Sarajevo is spelled S-A-R-A-J-E-V-O. S-A-R-A-J-E-V-O. Sarajevo. And as he and his royal entourage were driving through the city, a man who had great pride in his own nation of Serbia, a Serbian nationalist, a guy who wanted Serbia to be its own place. His name was Gavrilo Princip, Gavrilo, 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 Princip, Princip. Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, emerged from the crowd and shot the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. Sorry, Sophie. Now, Princip is a member of an organization that's called the Black Hand. And the Black Hand was an organization that promoted Serbian nationalism to make Serbia its own country. So now, this is not like, the mayor of Sarajevo getting shot. This is the guy who's going to be the king of Austria, one of the largest empires on earth. And the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife touched off a diplomatic crisis. And so each side looks to their allies and they're like, what do we do? You got my back? You going to help? And so shortly after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. Declared war against Serbia. Well, if you declare war against a nation, that nation's going to be like, where's my allies at? So the alliance system, what we talked about earlier, begins to pull one nation after another, into this conflict. Nations that had nothing to do with this Archduke Ferdinand are now being pulled into this conflict because of the alliance system. So, Germany, which was obligated by treaty to support Austria-Hungary, they were allied together, they declared war on Russia. Did Russia have anything to do with this? No, it was a Serbian nationalist that assassinated the Austrian heir to the throne. But now Germany's declaring war on Russia. And then Germany declares war on France, Russia's ally. Then Germany invades Belgium. Britain declares war on Germany. And now World War I has begun. It has begun. The fighting starts. And I'm here to tell you it is horrific. Absolutely. It is the worst loss of human life in history until World War II. So, on August the 3rd, 1914, Germany invades Belgium. Here's a little map here. Here's Germany. Here's Belgium. Germany invades Belgium, following a strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, which I have, unfortunately, I got it spelled up here. The Schlieffen Plan. This plan calls for a quick holding action against Russia, combined with a quick drive through Belgium and Paris. After France had fallen, the two German armies would meet up and then turn away and go toward Russia to defeat Russia. Initially, as German troops swept across Belgium, thousands of civilians fled in terror, having their homes destroyed, crops burned. And in the Belgian capital of Brussels, there was an American war correspondent there reporting the actions and talked about all these people who had lost their homes, who had nowhere to go. And there was nowhere to go. What is a person who's lost their home in war and has nowhere to go called? Refugees. And so a refugee is a person who flees in search of protection or shelter, usually in times of war or religious persecution. So England, Russia, all the allies, the Triple Entente, were unable to save Belgium. And the allies retreated to France, where they were able to stop the German advance. And basically, upon doing that, when they stop them, it's like a stalemate. One side cannot go past the other. And so by by the spring of 1915, both sides had dug trenches. Trenches. So you got like basically all across France, from north to south, all the way across, you have a trench. One on each side. The Germans had a trench, and then the Allies have a trench. And this two parallel systems of deep, rat-infested trenches crossed Europe all the way from France to the Belgian coast, all the way to the Swiss Alps. We're talking an enormous trench system. German soldiers occupying one side of the trench. And this is the construction of one side of the trench. Allied soldiers on one side, German soldiers on the other. And there's three different kinds of trenches. You got your frontline trench, you got your support trench, and then you have like your officers' quarters and command post. So up here, this is where your average, typical, everyday soldier that's getting ready to go over and get his head shot off is going to be and live. Then back here you have your supplies. This is where you go eat, try to sleep maybe, or maybe you sleep here. And then in the back is the reserve trench and where the commanders are, dug out under the ground in like a cave, man-made cave. Now, so this is just one side. On the other side, they have the exact same setup, just facing the different direction. And every once in a while, between the trenches lay this area, which is called no man's land. Why is it called no man's land? It is a place where no man can survive. I mean, think about it. Both sides have dug a trench, not just because, they want to live in a hole in the ground, because it's impossible to gain an inch. Because how are you going to overtake this? Well, you got to go out of this trench, run across this land, jump down in the other guy's trench, and kill them. But this is not like the American Civil War where, hey, okay, I got a musket, bang. All right, let me reload. Just wait a minute. This is a highly industrialized war with guns that are called machine guns, able to just pull down the trigger and shoot a stream of bullets. Not to mention hand grenades and howitzers and rockets and cannons and airplanes and tanks. These are massive machines of death and destruction, okay? So whenever the call was given for the soldiers in the front line trench to come out of the trench and charge into no man's land, it was not uncommon to lose entire regiments of men in seconds being mowed down by machine gun fire, okay? Because it's not just one dude with a machine gun. Everybody's got one. So going out of the trench into no man's land was always a dangerous and deadly proposition. As you might imagine, the scale of, just slaughter, absolute slaughter. It was horrific. There's one battle, it's called the Battle of Somme. Somme. S-O-M-M-E. The First Battle of Somme, which began on July the 1st, 1916, and it lasted until mid-November. So July, August, September, October, 4.5 months. 4.5 months of one battle. On the first day of this battle, the first day, the British, one side, lost 60,000 men. 60,000 men in a day for one side. Final casualties of this one battle totaled 1.2 million people. 1.2 million people. Okay, guys, what is the deadliest war in American history? The American Civil War. About 600,000 men died in those 4 or 5 years of fighting. 1.2 million died in a single battle, the Battle of Somme. This is death and destruction beyond anything as the world had ever seen. Okay? 60,000 people in a day. Now, do you know the result of this battle? You would think after 1.2 million people gave their lives, there'd be some action happen. You know what happened? They dug trenches 7 miles deeper inland, and then they kept fighting. 7 miles changed hands. 7 miles.
Where are they getting all the men from?
Well, that's a good question. Where are they getting all the men from? Did all these countries have big militaries? Yeah, because of what? Militarism. They were ready to go. So, this style of fighting, where you come up out of your trench and charge and then get machine gunned down, this is called trench warfare. Trench warfare. It is bloody, it is gruesome, and that is just the nature of World War I. It's military operations in which forces attack and counterattack from systems of fortified ditches rather than standing shoulder to shoulder and fighting, like Napoleonic style. Okay? So the fighting is just devastating, inconclusive, not really gaining anything. Okay? So, haven't mentioned America getting involved yet. America involved at the beginning of World War I? No, not even close. Most Americans saw no reason to join a struggle 3,000 miles away when this war did not threaten Americans. It did not threaten American property. But this does not mean, however, that individual Americans were indifferent about who would win. Americans had favorites, and a public opinion was strong about it, about who would win. Now, that doesn't mean that public opinion was united. Some people were pulling for the Germans. Other people were pulling for the Allies. And people had strong opinions about it. So we were divided over who we wanted to win at the beginning, at the outset of the war. Because America itself, we are a diverse nation. Have we talked about immigration in America this year? Where's a lot of those immigrants coming from? Who came with the Irish? Germans. Are a lot of Americans have German heritage? Everybody's head should be moving up and down. Yeah. And then we talked about new immigration. Where are those new immigrants coming from? Southern and Eastern Europe. You guys know where Sarajevo is in Serbia? Eastern Europe. So we have a large portion of our population divided over who we want to win. So many Americans also, and obviously a lot of Americans didn't want us involved. Most Americans wanted no involvement with it, but that doesn't mean they were not pulling for one side over another. So, the majority of Americans favored victory for the Allies rather than the Central. But they did not want to join the Allies' fight. Do we? Yes. In other words, there has to be some things to happen because if the American people don't want to go to war, are we going to war? It has to be, at least on paper, we're a democracy, and if the people don't want to go, then we're not going to go. Okay? So, things have to happen to change the public's opinion, whether it be yellow journalism, like the Spanish-American War, or something else. In this instance, it's something else. Okay? And the thing that begins to, it is a series of events, not just one thing. But in 1914, the British did a naval blockade of Germany. What does that mean? You can see on this map. What does that mean?
They blocked off the training to the ports.
That's right. Nothing goes into Germany. Nothing comes out of Germany. The British blockaded the German coast to prevent stuff like weapons, military supplies, even food from reaching the German people. Now, the results of this blockade are twofold. There are two happenings that occur as a result of this. First, who do you think's bringing a lot of this stuff to Germany? American ships. Just because we are isolationist and we don't want involved, what did we say about our commercial interests? We're all over the globe. We sell stuff to everyone everywhere. So when American ships carrying goods that were intended to make it to the shores of Germany were refused and sent back, they don't get there. And a lot of the stuff we're sending is food. So a lot of American shippers are upset at the British because of our blockade, because they're losing money. Americans don't like to lose money, just like anybody else. That's a first effect. A second effect, kind of like, do you think during World War I there's a lot of agriculture and farming going on in Germany? No, everything's destroyed. And so now they're not creating anything for themselves, and what they needed is not making it to shore. So what do you think happens to the German people? Deeper, worse than a depression. Widespread starvation, also known as famine. And by 1917, famine was rampant in Germany. You guys, everybody know what famine is? Yeah, like lots of people starving to death, not just like, I skipped lunch. No, we're talking starvation. How bad do you think this famine was?
Pretty bad.
750,000 German people starved to death. 750,000 Germans people starved. This is not soldiers. These are your elderly and your young children starving to death. As a result of this British blockade. British has a really good navy. They shut it down. Nothing got in. So Americans had been angry at Britain's blockade, which threatened their freedom of the seas and prevented American goods from reaching the German ports. But Germany's not just going to take this lying down. So Germany responds to the British blockade. I mean, their people are starving to death. And so Britain responds to the German blockade by doing a counter blockade with German U-boats. You guys know what a U-boat is?
The little submarine with missiles.
What is it? A submarine? Yeah, that's right. So this is an actual photo here of German people starving to death, unfortunately. You know, children, women. And so what Germans begin to employ are their U-boats. U-boat stands for, it's a German word, Unterseeboots. Isn't it fun to say? That's one word, Unterseeboots, under the water boat. It's a submarine, okay? Now, Germans would use these U-boats, and any British or Allied ship that they found around the waters of Great Britain would be fired upon and sunk for any reason. If you're a boat and you're not German, you're sunk. If you're just a guy out there fishing, you're sunk. Can you blame them? 750,000 German people starving to death. You blame them? So, as a result of this, one of the worst disasters of this policy occurred on May 7th, 1945, when a German U-boat fired on a British liner, a boat that is intended to haul people. Think of a big cruise ship called the Lusitania. You ever heard of it? And this was off the southern coast of Ireland, where 1,200 civilians were dead. It killed 1,200 people. Of those 1,200 people, 128 of them were Americans. 128 Americans killed by a German U-boat. What kind of boat was this?
Cruise ship?
Yeah, like a cruise ship. Kind of like the Titanic. Imagine like, you guys seen the movie? They're not up to no, it's just people on a boat eating dinner. The Germans fired on this cruise ship, the Lusitania, and sunk it and killed everybody on board. The Germans defend their actions. They say, yeah, we did it. We thought they had ammunition on board. No, it's a cruise ship, guys. Like going to a Carnival cruise ship and sinking it. Like, hey, maybe they got guns on there. So despite Germany's explanation, is America like, oh, okay, it's cool. We know you're starving to death. No. Americans are pretty outraged with Germany because 128 Americans lost their lives. Like people on vacation. I don't know why you're going on vacation to Europe during this war, though. I don't know. But American public opinion began to turn against Germany. Began to turn. And that is, we will continue with the provocations of Germany against the United States tomorrow.